J.D. Vance, an experienced professional, stepped into Clara's kitchen in Springfield, Ohio, a small diner marked by a faded neon sign that hummed softly. The rich aroma of fried onions and freshly brewed coffee greeted him as he walked in. A local had enthusiastically recommended the place, praising its hand-pressed burgers and perfectly crispy onion rings as the ultimate comfort food. However, after a long day filled with meetings and difficult discussions, J.D. felt completely drained. He takes a quiet bite before hitting the road again. The diner is small and cozy, exuding a well-worn charm. Old Polaroids line the walls, capturing smiling faces from years gone by. The air is thick with the scent of grease and coffee, accompanied by the low hum of conversation. The waitress recognizes J.D., but her smile fades almost instantly. Noticing her reaction, J.D. quickly scans the room, his eyes settling on a man taking a bite of his sandwich. J.D., a diner, is met by a woman in a plaid jacket who gives him a sharp look before heading out. He isn't unfamiliar with this kind of reaction. He's been in plenty of places where the atmosphere shifts the moment people realize he's still around. The waitress, eyeing him carefully, hesitates before asking if he wants to eat in or take his order to go. It's a simple question, but she lingers for a moment before slipping through the kitchen doors, leaving J.D. standing there. At the counter, a man suddenly appears. J.D. sits in a booth at the swinging doors, surrounded by a quiet group of patrons. Music plays softly in the background, but the waitress hesitates, unsure whether she should serve him tonight. The tension in the room isn't about a full house or closing time. It feels more personal. The silence grows heavier, broken only by the faint hiss of the grill in the back. A fork clinks against a plate, but conversation is scarce. The air is thick with anticipation, making the dining experience feel strangely intimate. J.D. watched as a woman stood waiting, her expression firm, holding her ground. His gaze drifted past her to the kitchen window, where two cooks peeked out from behind a stack of plates. He cleared his throat, resting his hands on his hips as he exhaled slowly. He had faced far worse, heated debates, hostile interviews, and crowds that didn't hesitate to push back. Being turned away from a roadside diner wasn't new. A sudden cough broke the silence, and J.D. briefly locked eyes with an older patron. Across the room, a man in a worn denim jacket, hardened by years of labor, sits at the counter. Nearby, a younger man, likely in his 30s, leans back with a smirk, waiting for something to unfold. J.D. notices the quick glances, the lingering stares, and feels a flicker of something more unyielding. He could have walked away, let it go, or demanded an explanation. As a U.S. senator, he could have turned it into a headline. Instead, he simply nods, his expression steady, and asks if he can talk. The waitress, J.D. and the other patrons grow, tense as an old man stirs up trouble in the diner. J.D. considers slipping out through a side door, but the atmosphere in the room feels stifled, as if the diner itself is holding its breath. Just then, a man named Don steps in, his eyes scanning J.D. before posing a question. J.D. meets his gaze steadily, countering with one of his own. Why wouldn't he be able to help? The room lingers in uncertainty, leaving the diner to grapple with the moment and search for an answer. Don exhales sharply, wiping his hands on his apron, his posture tense. He'd rather be anywhere else. J.D. senses the weight of the moment, but Don's clenched jaw and the way he rubs his neck make it clear. He has a business to run and no interest in trouble. He doesn't answer right away, instead casting a glance at the counter where the old man picks at his food, slower now. The younger guy in the booth watches intently, arms crossed, soaking in the tension. J.D. understands. This isn't about a single decision. It's about the unspoken pressure steadily mounting in the room. In a small town, opinions settle like stone, and Don hesitates to speak. A young man in the booth makes an effort to make him feel unwelcome, but he doesn't bite. J.D., itching, For a confrontation, locks eyes with Don and pointedly asks if that's what he wants. But JD doesn't push further. His words hang in the air, giving Don a moment to reconsider, to push back against whatever unspoken pressure lingers. The situation isn't simple. It demands a careful balance between understanding the town's deep-seated views and challenging the weight of prevailing opinions. Don and JD stood in the room, both aware of the tension. Don wanted to avoid chaos, and JD seemed to acknowledge it with a nod, even suggesting he could leave. But instead of walking away, he pulled out a chair and sat down. The room went still. Don didn't slam anything or puff up. He simply perched on the table, composed, as if this was expected. He studied JD for a long moment before exhaling slowly. JD only shrugged. It was clear Don didn't want him there, but JD understood and was willing to talk. Don had a certain resolve, that much was obvious, but JD ignored it. This wasn't the usual shouting match or dramatic exit people might have anticipated. This time, it was different. Don, a business owner, rested his weight on a chair, his smudged apron bearing the signs of a long day. He wasn't one to start fights or chase headlines, but he wanted people to think about JD. His eyes scanned the room, hoping someone else might speak up. The waitress shifted uneasily behind the counter, and the old man's fork hung mid-air over his plate. Don looked back at JD, recognizing the deeper issue. People don't trust politicians, and some of JD's words had rubbed folks the wrong way. JD leaned back, steady but unreadable. Don didn't know him personally, not really, so he finally asked, "Are you just another random guy?" Don, a TV host, stepped into the quiet room, accompanied by a young man who quickly made it clear. The conversation wasn't about the TV host, but about JD himself. The young man grinned, relishing the attention, while JD simply nodded, accepting the situation without resistance. Then, with a smirk, the man told JD to leave. But the diner remained silent. Even the kitchen, once filled with the sounds of clattering dishes, had gone still. Don sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, muttering under his breath, "This isn't what I signed up for tonight." The young man hesitated, his smirk faltering. Don spoke up again, shifting the focus to the opinions of others. JD didn't react, only tilting his head slightly. Don pointed out that people think JD is just another politician. Full of empty words, the same old promises wrapped in expensive suits. JD nodded slowly, absorbing the comment. The young man scoffed, unimpressed. JD leaned forward, ready to respond, but for a moment, no words came. Still, he pressed on, despite knowing all too well the frustration he had grown up with. The conversation was layered, part frustration, part challenge, but also an unspoken attempt to truly understand one another. The old man, a construction worker for 40 years, had been left behind, by family, by friends, by politicians. Yet, despite it all, he still found the strength to push forward, doing things no one expected, even something as simple as rising from his chair. He finally spoke, his voice rough with years of labor, mentioning the dry state of the town. JD met his gaze, recognizing someone who hadn't run off when times got tough. The waitress shot a quick glance at Don, while the cooks, along with the young man, remained silent. JD turned to Don, who, after a brief pause, called out, "Mary, get him a menu." The young man let out a huff but didn't argue. Mary nodded, taking the menu and stepping forward. JD and Mary sat together, sharing a meal at the restaurant. He wasn't sure how he felt about her yet, but the easy rhythm of their conversation kept things light. Mary warned him about the coffee, calling it stronger than he might expect. JD took a sip and winced, prompting a few chuckles that softened the mood. Across from him, Don watched silently as JD considered everything. After a moment, Don gave a slight nod and JD decided to stay, letting out a laugh. Don smirked, amused. "Most guys would have sued us," he muttered. Mary slid a juicy burger in front of JD. He picked it up, took a bite, and for the first time that night, the tension seemed to ease. Don and JD were caught in the heat of the moment, tension thick in the air. For a second, the room froze. Then Don let out a laugh, breaking the silence. JD wiped his hands, and slowly, the diner came back to life. Plates clinking, voices humming, the usual rhythm returning. Don remained skeptical, watching JD closely. But JD only grinned. What started as a rejection had shifted into something else, something unexpected. It became a moment in Clara's kitchen that no one there would ever forget. The text invites readers to reflect on their own experiences. Have they ever faced the choice of walking away or staying to listen to someone's story? It encourages meaningful conversations and understanding. If they found the discussion thought-provoking, they're encouraged to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay updated on more real-life stories. The next story will be coming soon.